I'm David Knowles, and from Washington, D.C., this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we report on the latest updates from the front lines, discuss Kim Jong-un's visit to Russia to meet Vladimir Putin, and we hear the first of our interviews from our trip to America. Dom Nicholls talks to Olena Bidovanets, a mental health practitioner from Ukraine at the Boulder Crest Foundation. They talk about mental health, stress and resilience, both for individuals in war and society at large.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
1 year ago, the world was bracing for the fall of Kyiv. Well, I just come from a visit to Kyiv, and I can report Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 12th of September, 1 year and 200 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls in Charlotte, North Carolina, assistant comment editor Francis Durnley with me in Washington, and Joe Barnes, our Brussels correspondent, speaking from Brussels. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
So in the last 24 hours, Ukraine says that Russia has launched 10 missile, 53 air and 56 rocket salvo strikes across the country, both troops and civilian objects. The regional governor of Kherson said that 14 shells landed in the city there. This is Alexander Produkin. He said the Russian military aimed at the residential quarters of the populated areas, critical infrastructure, administration and educational institutions in Kherson. 6 people injured there. Elsewhere, though, in the actual the counteroffensive as such. Let's go first of all to the east around Bakhmut. There's very heavy fighting there. Kyiv is said to have tactical success. That is being written up by the Kremlin-installed local official, the city there in the east around Bakhmut. So this is Vladimir Rogov. He's a member of Zaporizhia's regional government installed by Russia, or the temporary government in that area. He said on Telegram, there's been tactical success around Bakhmut. The fighting here is very heavy. Ukraine's military said it had advanced south of the city, the high ground there to the south, whilst repelling a number of counterattacks. Then if we move further to the west, we were talking yesterday about the fighting around Bucha. That is still going on. That's reported by War Gonzo, who's a prominent Russian Telegram blogger. But he was saying in the Zaporizhia direction, Ukraine forces advanced with artillery in the area of the village and attacked through a wooded area just to the north. Now, Putin has said that there are no results, his words, no results of the Ukrainian counteroffensive so far. He said that Ukraine had suffered heavy losses. This is coming out of Russian news agencies. He said that Kyiv had lost 71,000 troops, 543 tanks and 18,000 armoured vehicles. None of that can be verified by the Telegraph. We know casualties are very high. We don't have any accurate figures or very accurate figures at all, but I don't think it's that. I don't think it's up there, certainly not the tanks. I just don't think they've got 543 tanks that could have been lost in a counteroffensive. Anyway, Putin was speaking at an economic conference in Vladivostok. He's expected to host North Korean leader Kim Jong-un either today or tomorrow. Francis may know more about that. But Russia's defense ministry have denied claims that Ukraine's managed to gain a foothold in the eastern village of Optina, which we've been talking about for a few days now. Kyiv says it has managed to capture a small part of that settlement, which has put it within a couple of miles of Donetsk International Airport, which is no longer a functioning airport. It was held for a while in 2015 by the Ukrainian forces and then eventually overrun by the Russian forces, masquerading as local separatists. But they're back within a couple of miles of there, which has not been held. That some of that area has not been held since 2015 by Ukraine. Now, Russia saying that there is no advance there and Ukraine suffering heavy losses. We can't confirm this. It's exceptionally difficult to get accurate information out of there. But we will obviously keep you posted as when we look at other sites that can geolocate fire and what have you. Now, separately, Britain's MOD said the latest defence intelligence update said that Russia has revamped its air defences around Moscow in a bid to halt the repeated drone strikes on the capital. There are images out there, you'll find them on social media, but MOD today marking that SA-22 defence systems have been positioned on elevated towers and high buildings, possibly as high-profile reassurance, they're saying, to the public. I'm not sure that would be overly reassuring if your air defence is coming back into the very heart of your capital. And then also, on Wagner, we think Russia's National Guard might be trying to recruit former members or take them under their command completely in order to prevent a repeat of the rebellion in June. This is coming out of the Institute for the Study of War. I think we're going to hear more of a little bit later. But they cited reports in Russian media that the Rosgvardia, which this group that reports directly to Putin, they are thought to be actively going after the former Wagner members. And MOD say, so this British MOD say, this is potentially to exert more direct control over former Wagner elements in the hopes of consolidating domestic security following the rebellion. Now, obviously, it comes in the wake of Prigozhin's exit from this particular drama, but we still don't know what the long-term future is for Wagner. I don't think it has as an entity of its own. I don't think it has a long-term future, but it will still be used as a brand, I think. And then just finally, Russia has started expanding military bases along its border with Finland. Joe has written about this. We'll hear more shortly. So I won't snaffle his sandwiches, but Joe's going to talk to us about increased infrastructure and movements around there from satellite imagery.
Thank you very much, Dom. We'll come back to you later, I think, to hear a little bit more about where you've been and what you've seen and who you've met. Francis Turnley, though, can I come to you? Do you want to start with the news that Dom referenced about the meeting between the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin?
Sure, thanks, David. I reported yesterday we were expecting that meeting, and we understand that Kim Jong-un has indeed crossed the border into Russia. A Russian state news agency confirmed that Kim's armoured train had entered the Primorsky region, with images showing it with dark green carriages being pulled along a track by a Russian Railways locomotive. As expected, Kim will meet Putin in Far East, in Vladivostok. This is coming from Dmitry Peskov, Kremlin spokesman, and there will be a lunch in Kim's honour. It will be a fully fledged visit. There will be negotiations between two delegations, and after that, if necessary, the leaders will continue their communication in a one-on-one format. They said they would ignore US warnings over their talks. Washington has said that North Korea will pay a price if it supplies Moscow with weapons for the Ukraine conflict. Yet that does remain the expectation. Top military commanders, arms industry officials and diplomats accompanied Kim Jong-un on his trip, hinting at a defense-heavy agenda. The North Korean leader is apparently bringing a ruling party official in charge of munitions policies, who's accompanied him on numerous recent tours of factories producing artillery shells and missiles. This is coming from South Korea's Unification Ministry, who, of course, are monitoring North Korea constantly and know what's up. North Korea may have tens of millions of artillery shells and rockets based on Soviet designs that would give a huge boost to the Russian army in Ukraine in the manner that I described yesterday. Also identified in photos were the chairman of North Korea's Space, Science and Technology Committee and a Navy admiral linked with North Korean efforts to acquire spy satellites and nuclear-capable ballistic missile submarines. Experts say North Korea would struggle to acquire such capabilities without external help, although it's not clear if Russia would share such sensitive technologies. Kim may also seek badly needed energy and food aid. So there may be other things that are on the table as opposed to just merely those advanced technologies. And yet, given the precarious Russian situation on the battlefield, one wouldn't be surprised if they'd be willing to go further in with the information that they shared with North Korea, not least because, of course, it benefits the hostile activities against the West. North Korea remains a consistent threat and hostile power in the eyes of many in the West, given its bellicose rhetoric and the fact that it's constantly doing nuclear tests. This also aids Moscow in the sense that it puts increasing pressure and eyes elsewhere rather than just purely on Moscow itself. The meeting is unlikely to just be about arms deals. However, Dr. Colin Alexander, a lecturer at Nottingham Trent University, has said that there is a sizable North Korean migrant population in Vladivostok. Some of it's there legally and with the blessing of Pyongyang to facilitate trade. Others are defectors who are critical of the regime. And whilst many are working in the construction industry, seeking money on the back of impoverished and sending it back to impoverished families in the South, it will be a topic of interest, no doubt, and maybe part of the reason why it's Vladivostok that has been chosen for the place of discussions. Now, staying with Russia, in last week's Defense in Depth video, I spoke about Putin's manipulations of history for his own ends. And he's made an interesting intervention on the subject of the Soviet invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia, which took place in 1956 and 1968, respectively, following calls within those countries for more freedoms from Moscow, two events I have talked about in the podcast in the past, foundational events in the modern identity in those free countries in Europe today. Now, speaking at the Economic Forum in Vladivostok, according to the BBC, Putin said that it's not right to do anything in foreign policy that harms the interests of other people. So the full context here is a moderator asked him how he would respond to those who say that the Soviet Union behaved like a colonial power when it sent tanks into Prague and Budapest in those years. Putin said, and I quote, "We acknowledged a long time ago that part of the Soviet policy was mistaken and only led to tensions in relations. One must not do anything in foreign policy that comes in direct contradiction with the interests of other peoples." And he then went on to say that countries in the West, primarily the US, were now making the same mistake as the Soviets made then. So he said they put pressure on their allies, their so-called partners. They have no friends. They only have interests. That is a continuation of a well-known British formula. I find this, suffice to say, extremely interesting. Again, it utilizes narratives which he knows appeals to certain countries he wants to do business with, attacking former colonial powers such as Britain, and in doing so, seeking to mask the fact that it's Russia itself that's behaving like a colonial power today. And as the BBC emphasizes, these comments about the Soviet Union's actions in Hungary and Czechoslovakia do appear to contradict the views of some within Putin's own inner circle. So back in August, a history textbook written by one of Putin's advisors, Vladimir Mendensky, claimed that the 1956 Hungarian Revolution was a fascist uprising organized by the West, and said that the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Hungary in 1990 had been a huge mistake. And I also wonder in that context whether by saying that line, and again I'll read it, "one must not do anything in foreign policy that comes in direct contradictions with the interests of other peoples," that there's an insinuation there that Ukrainians are not another people, but rather are still part of Russia, or at the very least fall under the Russian sphere of influence, and for that reason cannot be articulated in his mind as being a separate state, a separate country. But again, we don't know that for certain, but I just do wonder that that phrasing is deliberately chosen. Either way, I don't believe that Putin is genuinely mournful of the way the Soviet Union conducted itself in the past. Rather, he is casting a glaze over certain moments in history that help him at this particular moment. Now, as an aside, he does really seem to have it in for Britain at the moment. He's also claimed that the UK was behind an alleged Ukrainian plot to sabotage a nuclear power station in Russia. He said that Ukrainian saboteurs were intercepted by Russia's FSB security service and then admitted under interrogation that they had been trained by British instructors. Something impossible to verify. We know no more details, but he has articulated this. Russian propaganda obsesses about Britain almost as much as America. You'll remember that bizarre anti-British rant on Russian state TV last year when a Russian politician told Brits to pray to their moss-covered queen, I have no idea what that means, and to go and eat porridge, which I think reveals a lot about the perceptions of what us Brits get up to. I wouldn't mind, but the only time I've ever eaten porridge was actually in Moscow. But that's a story for another time. Lastly, just a couple of quick ones, David. Zelensky has vetoed an attempt by Ukrainian politicians to keep their assets hidden from the public in another anti-corruption move. So certain campaigners in Ukraine had complained that the proposed law would leave MPs unaccountable and undo certain crucial reforms that came out of Ukraine's revolution in 2014. And Zelensky seemingly agrees. He said, "I think everyone understands the reason for the veto. Declarations should be open immediately, not in a year. The registry should be opened now." So his anti-corruption drive, which has become increasingly public in the last year or so, is seemingly continuing. And finally, in another sign of why Putin wants this war to drag on for as long as possible, a pro-Kremlin populist pledging to end military aid to Ukraine is on course to win power in Slovakia's elections later this month. So Bratislava has so far shown very strong support for its eastern neighbour, becoming the first NATO nation to deliver fighter jets in the face of the Russian invasion. However, opinion polls indicate that the September 30th election will be won by a party whose leader, Robert Fico, has made comments in line with Kremlin rhetoric. So Mr. Fico has claimed that the war was started by Ukrainian fascists. He opposes Kyiv's bid to join NATO and says that he will immediately stop all deliveries of military aid. All very concerning from the Ukrainian point of view, no doubt. And while Slovakia is not one of the key backers in Ukraine in the European context, it is nonetheless one that is very much geographically relevant to what Ukraine is suffering given their proximity to the country. So no doubt this will be a frustration. Thus far, Ukraine has been lucky in that Western elections have broadly seen parties and leaders who seek to maintain support to the country. Yet it is inevitable in the natural cycles of democracies that parties with contrasting views on core issues will be elected. And that is one of the things that Putin is relying on. In one of the interviews I did for the podcast yesterday, which listeners will hear in due course, I discussed this in relation to the United States and how very different the calculations might have been in the Kremlin had the Republican Party been as strong or even stronger on Ukraine than the Democrats under Joe Biden. This will continue to be a key subject of discussion for us while we're here, and I imagine will be one of the questions we'll put to our panel at the event at the embassy on Thursday.
Thank you very much, Francis, for all of that. Incidentally, I thought the moss-covered Queen remark just made the Queen sound really badass, but there we are. Joe Barnes, there's two stories we want to talk to you about. Dom mentioned your writing up of the story of the Russian activity in Finland. Do you want to take us through that first?
Yeah, so we have essentially satellite imagery that's been released by Finland's national broadcaster showing construction on two separate military bases. First, let's focus on the Alakurti military base, which is around 31 miles from the Finnish border. And there has been 3 large buildings constructed there, and they look like storage warehouses from what we can see. And the base is significant because it's part of Russia's 80th Separate Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade. So it's quite a mouthful. And they are quite prominently have been stationed in Ukraine for a lot of the time. The construction was quite quick. Each of the buildings were erected from foundation to full height within a single day of construction, according to comparisons of the satellite imagery. And then there's a chap quoted in the Finnish broadcaster's reporting called Major Marko Eklund, and he's a retired Finnish military operative who worked with Finnish military intelligence. And he said the halls, which are about 100 meters long and 25 meters wide, could be used to house up to 40 armored vehicles that would support a Russian battalion. So Russia traditionally has stationed about 2,000 troops at the Alakurti military base. But as I said, the majority of these forces have been deployed in Ukraine since February last year. What's significant about them? They're trained to fight in the cold and dark Arctic conditions. But as I said, they've suffered quite heavy losses. In June, it was reported that Ukrainian troops struck a command post manned by the brigade near the front lines. We don't actually know how much was lost. And then separate images have revealed the construction of a new large warehouse, basically sitting in between artillery cannons and tanks stored at the, and excuse my pronunciation, the Petrozavodsk base, which is a Russian sort of military dump for tanks and artillery cannons, as I said, 108 miles from the border. The kit stored at the site is enough to equip at least one motorized brigade of around 4,000 Russian soldiers. Again, Major Eklund believes the new building there can store up to 50 armored vehicles. But what's important about this site is while most of the kit has been gathering dust there and it's sat at the base since sort of military bases in the area were basically disbanded as the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s. But what we do know is equipment has been taken from this base and sent to replenish Russian forces in Ukraine. So satellite images recently taken in July showed the 2S3 Atasia self-propelled howitzer, which is basically looks like a tank, but it's actually an artillery howitzer, which were first manufactured in 1967, but then were built more recently as well. They were being loaded onto trains. And artillery units stationed at the base have steadily declined, with more than 100 howitzers believed to have been sent to the front lines. So what kind of officials are thinking here is this base is, rather than being used to challenge NATO, because Finland's NATO's most recent member, it is probably being used to fix up this gear and send it off to the front line. But just a little bit of context on why this is all very important. So Finland's membership of NATO added about 833 miles of frontier to NATO's border with Russia. And it's close to where the Russian military houses the single largest concentration of nuclear weapons in the world. And when Finland joined NATO, Moscow earlier this year threatened countermeasures against the Western military alliance. So there's been a lot of rhetoric around there. And while Finland was a military neutral country, Russia neglected the area and decided not to build up as much of a presence there. But suddenly now we have this presence being built up. It may just be like bellicose rhetoric, attempting to show that Russia's still trying to do something, because a lot of, if you speak to officials in NATO and various NATO member states, they will suggest that Russia won't be at full capability, full capacity to actually launch another ground invasion for potentially 3, 4, 5 years after the attrition it suffered in Ukraine. So at the moment, it looks more like rhetoric, but it's probably something they've got an eye on in the future. And then I'll move to the next story, which is an interesting one out of Britain yesterday. And that is Russian forces targeted a civilian cargo ship in a missile attack thwarted by Ukraine. And that was according to newly declassified British intelligence yesterday. So 2 Caliber cruise missiles were fired at the Primus, which is a Liberian flag ship, which was due to be carrying steel to Senegal while it was docked in the southern port of Odessa on August the 24th. So Ukraine's air defense systems in the area were able to intercept the missiles, which were fired from a ship belonging to Russia's Black Sea fleet in the Sea of Azov. So James Cleverly was quoted as saying, "Putin is trying to win a war he will not win, and these attacks show how desperate he is. In targeting cargo ships and Ukrainian infrastructure, Russia is hurting the rest of the world." Rishi Sunak also made reference of it in his address to the House of Commons when he updated them on his G20 summit appearance in Delhi. He said, "Thanks to declassified intelligence, we know the Russian military targeted a civilian cargo ship in the Black Sea with multiple missiles on August the 24th. And he said the alleged attack showed just how desperate Putin is." And that many of our regular listeners would have heard Roland's fantastic dispatch from the Danube port of Ismail. We know how Ukraine is being targeted now more in the south. So when I was last in Ukraine in May and June, Kyiv was the main target. Russia was sending hundreds of millions of dollars worth of drones and missiles at it over the months of May and June. But now, as the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was a UN-Turkey brokered deal to get shipped out of the Black Sea, lapsed on July the 17th, Russia has turned its sights to basically targeting anything from silos, offices of shipment companies and the likes. And so the British intelligence report that we received said that around 280,000 tons of grain had been destroyed since July the 17th. And British officials say that is enough to feed more than 1 million people for a year. So that is the sort of the effect that the military attacks are having. And actually, this is the first sort of real Western evidence that Russia has targeted a civilian cargo ship since the US warned it would do just after Vladimir Putin pulled out of that grain deal. So it's an interesting revelation, but it also goes to show how well Ukraine has got the area defended against sort of Caliber missiles, which are meant to be one of Russia's most significant weapons, fired from ships in the Black Sea, have been kind of terrorizing civilian communities since the start of the war. And that's just, interesting to see how Ukraine's air defense is stopping it, but Russia is targeting civilian vessels for the first time, confirmed by a Western intelligence service.
Thank you very much for talking us through those stories, Joe. We've been in the US now for a couple of days. I think we're just about getting over the jet lag. Dom Nicholls, can you tell us a little bit about where you've been, what you've seen, and I'd be curious about how what you've seen and the people you're talking to, how that's different to potentially what you expected before you came out.
Sure. So I arrived on Friday and I got into Washington, went straight west up to the Blue Ridge Mountains, just up on the border there between Virginia, just overlooking West Virginia, actually up in Bluemont. I went there because I wanted to visit, and I did go and visit the Boulder Crest Foundation guys, a veterans and first responders wellness rehabilitation charity, non-profit, and they work with individuals and families as well, just to give a bit of space. They started off just to give a bit of space for the mind to relax, and then it morphed from there into actively running programs that can help people who have been through trauma, as they've expanded out of the veteran community and into first responders as well, because it's very appropriate, as in yesterday was 9/11, so we think about the trauma that a number of the first responders go through as well. So it was fascinating to speak to those guys up there. I was there for a couple of days with them. It was fascinating, both on programs for an individual and for society at large. A lot of the thinking is that many times the individual can feel very much alone because they think that this has only happened to them and no one else can possibly experience what they have. Now, that's not correct, and a lot of the effort is put into making them realize that. But actually, in a situation such as the war in Ukraine, when the whole society has gone through it, it's a completely different scale. But in many ways, because everyone's going through it together, there is that common base knowledge that everyone knows what you're talking about. There's a common understanding, a common context, but that also throws up its own challenges. Anyway, so that was the weekend up in Bluemont in the Blue Ridge Mountains, which was absolutely lovely. Stayed in the Bear's Den, didn't get eaten, as I suggested on Twitter. Managed to make it out of there, which was good. Then flew west, went to Colorado, went to see a number of folks there in Colorado Springs. I went to the US Air Force Academy yesterday, where I dialed in live on the pod there at dawn, speaking about the use of air power in the war and the likely future direction, and such things as, are drones just a new technology, or they fundamentally shifted the way we should think about air and space power. So you can, if you've not heard yesterday's pod, you can catch up with that. That was fascinating. And then also met up with longtime friend of the pod, John Spencer, former US Army Ranger and West Point of the Institute for War Studies, an urban warfare specialist. Fascinating. Did another pre-record with him. It's going to come out hopefully in the next few days. And rather than talk fantasy fleets and what's going to happen next, and do you think they'll do this, do you think they'll do that, we talked about hope and how hope can be a very good thing to have for a person, for an individual, a soldier, civilian, a society. But actually, it can also be very damaging. If you have too much hope and it is then dashed, that fall, that collapse in morale can be devastating. So political leaders, military leaders, civic leaders have to weave a very fine line between giving enough hope but not too much. So we had a great discussion about what that means for a military person. And then John finished off with an amazing story of an individual he met on his last visit to Ukraine, a guy who was not in the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol, but fought in Mariupol, tried to get into the Azovstal steel plant when everyone around him had been lost and was not able to make it. It was captured, tortured, managed to escape from his captors and lived on the run, basically scavenging around Mariupol for months, until one day, bizarrely, he was out. He used to go out at night looking for food. And at dusk one day when he went out, he saw a little girl looking at him from 100 meters or so away. And he thought, oh my God, am I going to be turned in? And the next day she had left out some food for him. And so he went a number of days and ate this food that had been left out. And then one day a telephone appeared. And he thought, is this a setup? It was a Russian. By then, Russia had control of Mariupol. And so is it a setup? But he took the chance and he managed to contact his people. And there was a very impressive Ukrainian Special Forces effort to go and get him out. Anyway, a much longer chat with John Spencer about that. That was fascinating. And I also caught up with the Ukraine frontline folks, Anne Robles and Stephen Watford, who's sending a non-profit organisation sending aid out to Ukraine. So that was fascinating. All caught up there in Colorado Springs. And those pre-records will be out in the next few days. And I'm now in North Carolina, in Charlotte. I'm at the Providence Day High School. I'm hoping to speak to a few folk here later on from a completely different angle, looking at the next generation, those that are going to inherit the world that we are creating now or fighting for now and trying to defend, and others trying to warp, to see what their views are about the world that they're going to inherit, where the challenges to democracy that they're learning about in some of their sort of civic leadership lessons here set alongside other challenges like climate change and what have you. What's important to the next generation. Anyway, so that's for today. Going to have a lovely chat in a few minutes after this, and then off later on tonight to New Jersey, and I'll tell you all about that tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Dom, for letting us know where you've been. Very glad, of course, you weren't eaten by a bear. Let's move then to our final thoughts. Francis or Joe, do you want to go first?
Happy to go first, David. I'll talk about what I've been up to later in the week, and I'm sure it'll include some more musings about American sports. But the really exciting thing for today is that you and I and our producer Giles will be going to the Institute for the Study of War, interviewing the key team there who produce the important briefings, which we frequently cite on the podcast. It's going to be an honor to meet them, people who listen to us, but also who, as I say, we read and digest their work very closely and have for some time. So that's going to be really interesting. We're doing a lot of interviews there, which no doubt we'll put on more than one pod either this week or next. In terms of final thoughts, just a quick one from me. Putin has been, as I was talking about earlier, a real chatterbox in the past 24 hours. And he said another interesting thing, which I just thought it was worth reflecting on very briefly. He has described legal proceedings against former US President Donald Trump as politically motivated persecution. And as we've discussed on the podcast previously, the Kremlin has repeatedly spoken out in defense of Trump, who is facing a series of charges linked to election interference. And the quote from him in full, I'll read now. As for the persecution of Trump, for us in the current environment, it's good because it shows the rottenness of the American system. It is a politically motivated persecution of one's competitor. It speaks, I think, to just how vital America is for Putin. He will be pushing for a Trump victory, or for Trump to be in the running for as long as possible, and thereby forcing other candidates in the Republican Party to adopt similar stances in an attempt to win around his supporters. And it also speaks to just how damaging to the US's international reputation as a standard bearer of democracy that this ongoing saga is. I don't say that in a partisan sense at all. I say it just to stress that the world is watching, and it is being used as a weapon for not only undermining the US's reputation, but the cause of democracy itself.
Thank you, Francis. Joe Barnes.
Yeah, rather than a sort of final thought and intellectual point, I wanted to tell just quite a nice story because there are rarely many of them from Ukraine at times. But the black bear that was found still alive in a zoo in Russian-occupied Donetsk once Ukrainian forces had managed to liberate the area in around October last year. So the zoo in the village of Ampil is going to be rehomed in Scotland. So Yampol the bear, as named after the zoo that it was found at, was still found alive. The 12-year-old black bear, he was concussed when a shell basically exploded near his cage and was just days away from dying, according to Scotland's Five Sisters Zoo, which is just west of Edinburgh, I believe. So the bear is currently recovering at a wildlife rescue centre in Belgium, but then will be transported to the Scottish Zoo after what has essentially been some sort of like monumental rescue effort to get the bear from eastern Ukraine into Poland, into Belgium, and then onto Scotland. But it's nice sometimes to hear sort of these stories. Yeah, people can do good and animals can be saved at a perilous time. And I will then go to you, David. We rarely hear a final thought from you, but it'd be nice to hear what you've been up to on your American travels.
Thank you very much, Joe. Love the story about the bear. Let's definitely do come back and tell us more about it when it makes it to Scotland. Yesterday, just very quickly, I was at Georgetown University with a group of really fascinating academics, Michael David Fox, Diana Dumitru, Jonathan Lincoln, and Miria Snegovaya. We spoke for about 2.5 hours in a sort of seminar fashion. I think we'll try and release it as a 2-part sort of special podcast. I must say, of course, it was organised by friend of the podcast, Jeffrey Berger. Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for your help. We spoke about Putinism as a sort of political concept. We spoke about the Russian elites and their relationship with Putinism. And we also talked about the history of Judaism in Ukraine. And also, completely fascinating, I thought, the relationship, the political and the diplomatic relationship between Israel, Ukraine, and Russia over the past few years. So it was a real pleasure to go to Georgetown. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you, Jeffrey, for helping organise. And I must say as well, we had some students in, some graduate students and some undergraduates, freshmen, who asked really fantastic questions. And I must admit, we got to the end of sort of 2 hours and a bit session of me trying to guide the conversation and listening to the academics, and the students came in and asked incredibly sharp questions. And I thought, Lord, I'll be out of a job quite soon. So we'll try and include all of that in the podcast. It should be a really fascinating deep dive into Vladimir Putin, Russian history, society, and also the history of Judaism in Ukraine and the relationship between Israel and Ukraine and Russia. Dom Nicholls, though, can I go to you for the very final thought?
Yeah, so whilst out here and looking at Ukraine, Obviously, I'm also keeping an eye back on London, because this week there's the DSEI conference, the Defence Security Expo International, big old arms conference thing happening in Docklands in East London. I normally just go along to catch up with some old mates and what have you, but each day there's normally one of the chiefs, the military chiefs, and or a political head giving a speech. And at some point this week, I think it might be tomorrow, Grant Shapps, Britain's new Defence Secretary, is going to give his first public speech on any kind of scale as Defence Secretary. So it'll be interesting to see what he says. Now, I think it's extremely unlikely that he's going to shift any or signal any shift in policy in either direction or scale, but he might use this as a chance to try and regain some of the leadership that has been lost in the external support for Ukraine that Britain has lost since Ben Wallace stepped back. Ben Wallace was he'd been there he'd been in the post 4 years, so he knew his job. He was absolutely on his game, and he with Lloyd Austin, the US Secretary of Defense, really got the international community galvanized about a year ago, and he was a real force of nature and pushed it on, blah, blah, blah. So him going has left a bit of a gap there, and some of the momentum from Britain's effort has waned. So it'll be very interesting to see what Grant Shapps says. This comes in the wake of, I think this week, Poland has said it's going to buy hundreds of HIMARS systems. They've also got loads of tanks, and we see that the Baltic and Scandinavian states really leading the charge in terms of European security ideas and demands. So, yeah, Britain's got it's up there, but slightly come off the boil, and it'd be very interesting to see how Grant Shapps handles his first big outing as Defence Secretary. So I'll be keeping an eye on that, as well as visiting lots of other places like the Fort Nonsense Brewing Company this evening.
Thank you very much, Joe, Francis and Dom. Now we have the first of our interviews from our trip to America. I'll let Dom introduce it.
So I'm in Bluemont in Virginia at the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I've come to visit the Boulder Crest Foundation, a not-for-profit organisation helping military and first responders. I'm with Josh Goldberg from Boulder Crest and Olena Bidovanets, a mental health practitioner from Ukraine. We're going to talk about post-traumatic growth and the issues that might be faced both now and in the future by Ukrainian society and the men and women fighting the war and living through it in every sector. Josh and Olena, very welcome. Thank you for joining us with the Telegraph. Josh, we can start with you. Can you just describe what Boulder Crest is, what you do, and what post-traumatic growth is, please?
In the simplest way, we call Boulder Crest the home of post-traumatic growth. And our vision is to ensure that members of the military, veteran, and first responder communities, which includes their families, can live great lives in the midst of stress, struggle, hardship, and trauma. And in order to make that happen, everything we do are programs based around the science of something called post-traumatic growth, which is the idea that what doesn't kill us can in fact make us wiser about what it means to live a good life.
Now, you were saying to me earlier on that sometimes the diagnosis, when we talk about mental health outcomes, the diagnosis can often be as bad in and of itself. What did you mean by that?
And we're not denying that, the struggle is real and that, people go through experiences that cause them to struggle greatly. But one of the things we see, and one of the things recent research around post 9/11 veterans in the States is revealing, is that the actual diagnosis for some people is the death knell. And for a lot of people, they believe that a diagnosis of PTSD or major depression disorder is final and fatal. And what it does is it renders the rest of their life as a fraction of what it used to be. And so you're sentencing people to diminished lives, and then you wonder why they don't hang around to experience them. And so for us, it's, I think, having a new language, having a new understanding of the idea that struggle is a part of all of our lives, and we will go through experiences that rock our world, and it's possible to grow in the aftermath of those experiences. And
you were saying that the concept of resilience, which is becoming, if not more understood, but certainly the phrase is more widely used now, but possibly in a misguided fashion when it comes to the individual. You were suggesting that the concept of resilience does not sit well with struggling well. Can you pick those two apart, please?
Yeah, and I think resilience is just one of those words that's been used and overused to the point where it doesn't mean much anymore. I mean, it's in traditional definition of resilience is to bounce back. And I think one of the things that's true, and if we just use the Ukrainian context, is, you don't bounce back from everything they're experiencing. You're either going to be worse for it or you're going to be better for it. So I think it sells a false vision of what's feasible in people's lives. And often in the military context, the way it's interpreted is get a bigger rucksack to put more stuff in. And what post-traumatic growth is about and what struggling well is about is recognizing that, yes, you will go through experiences that will alter you, that you cannot bounce back from, that you cannot get back to a prior version. But what you can do is you can grow because of those experiences. You can be better and live a better life because of what you've been through.
You were saying this is working well. I mean, it's beautiful here in Bluemont. We've had a look around the site here. You've got physical, you built structures here for people and families to come away and just take a break, but also other bits and pieces. There's a menage, you've got horses here, you've got other things to do, outdoor activity to meld the mind and the body. But you also have a lot of treatments that you do here. Could you just talk us quickly through what the setup is, how it came about, both the physical aspect for the families, but also the programs that you run?
So yesterday we celebrated our 10th anniversary of opening Boulder Crest, Virginia, and that is the first privately funded wellness center in the United States for combat veterans and their families. And the initial vision was to create a place where, after long deployments or time in the hospital, where members of the military and veteran community could come together with their families and rest, reconnect, and recharge. And as they started to do that, you get pulled aside by a wife who would say, thank you, this is beautiful, and can I ask a favor? Is there anything you can do for my husband? And you say, well, what's up with your husband? And she would say, the doctors say he has PTSD. You say, well, has he gone and gotten help? And either it was no, he won't, or he did, and they tried to medicate him, and he refused to do that. And so it led us on this journey to figure out what is it that allows people to go through really awful and hard experiences and come out the other side better than they were. We met Dr. Richard Tedeschi, who in 1995 coined the term post-traumatic growth, and asked Rich, could we build programs designed to help people transform their struggle into strength and post-traumatic growth? And he had said at the time that he had never tried that, but he was willing to give it a shot. And that's what we've done. So in our Virginia location, and we also have a place in Arizona, in Sonoyta, half the year we continue to stay true to our mission of providing a place for families to come together. But the remainder of the year are intensive programs that are indoor and outdoor, right? Educational and experiential programs that leverage warrior practices like horses and archery and labyrinths, designed to help people make peace with their past, learn to live in the present, and really plan for the great future that they deserve.
And we were talking about how this is received through different cultures, and it's working here. I think it's fair to say. And we were talking about the difficulty of exporting such a model in somewhere like the UK, where there is possibly an expectation that the National Health Service would pick this up, whereas here a lot of it is philanthropic work that's just got this idea going. Is that your experience? And are you hoping to take it overseas? And that will then lead us on to seeing, well, what is possible to work with Ukraine?
When I think about our approach and our model is we have these beautiful places, right? And physical infrastructure can be expensive, just like anyone who owns a home is well aware. And I do think we're certainly open when we think about our allied nations and the folks we're shoulder to shoulder with, to being able to replicate that. But what's even easier to replicate is the idea of post-traumatic growth. And as one person who's been through some hard things in their life said, you have to know post-traumatic growth exists for it to happen. You have to know it's okay for good things to happen after really bad things. So what I would say is part of our vision now is, how do you proliferate these concepts of PTG across the world? And I think culturally they'll resonate anywhere. I would hope, and at some point in the future, we can do more systematic work in the UK, Australia, to name a few. And we have had Brits go through our Warrior Path program. We've had Australians go through the program as well. So I'd say the future is sort of unknown, but the main thing for us is, you're scaling what you do and you're scaling what you know. And kind of the sequencing of that isn't all that material. I think what we have to do is we have to get away from this world that so heavily focuses on diagnosis and dysfunction that it really leads people to feel hopeless. And in the absence of hope, nothing good happens.
And Olena, how did you become involved with Boulder Crest?
So I came here because of the war. So when I studied global health at UW, I started doing that in 2021, and war escalated. I returned back to Ukraine to help, and I found this term PTG on Facebook. And as a beginner, I thought that it is another synonym of PTSD. So I was so surprised and I was so happy to find out that it's not a new synonym, it's something different. And even if the causes of the PTSD and PTG can be the same, right? And they can be even simultaneously, that is another paradox of post-traumatic growth, but it definitely gives a lot of hope. So when I had to write thesis, so I chose PTG and Ukrainian population. I met Richard Tedeschi, who introduced me later to Josh Goldberg, and I got another scholarship from Muskie program, and I came here to do my internship. What do you
think? Are these models exportable to Ukraine? Is this a model that is based or scalable from the individual to a society? Is it as applicable to the school pupils, the teachers, everybody working in the cities and farms, as well as those in the military in Ukraine?
I want to tell you, first of all, PTG, even if it was coined in 1995, it's not a new concept. It was all time with humankind. It was just Lawrence Calhoun and Richard Esky, they coined that term. And definitely it's applicable and for individual, but as well for the whole population. And it's not only about Americans or only Ukrainians, it says for the whole world. Just even talking about Ukraine, because people are during the war, I think it's a very specific situation. It's being in the midst of trauma. And at the same time, it's very important to tell that PTG is not only outcome, but it's a process. So I think if we can tell about a window of opportunity, that is the best time to bring this concept and try to apply in our circumstances. But again, I just wanted to emphasize that even for Ukrainian population, it's not a new concept. Since 2015, a lot of psychotherapists, mental health specialists, they were already implementing that. Right now, I think it's just the best opportunity to bring some model how we can practically implement this concept.
Mrs. Zelensky has talked about it, and she's used the term post-traumatic growth. She says she believes in it. And it's interesting that you say that the cause or the root causes, that it can come from the same place, PTG and PTSD. But I'm very struck that the D, I mean, the PTSD is we're saying that is a thing, that is a disorder, whereas post-traumatic growth is much more of a process. Where do the two split apart, and how can you start putting in place things now, today, in Ukraine for post-traumatic growth that we in UK, US may not have looked at before? We've waited for the event to pass and then dealt with it, whereas it sounds as if PTG, there's things you can start doing now.
Oh, very deep question. So I think many people, they were already growing, not knowing even about that. So, but in general, I would say that it's very important to know about PTG, that it exists, to be able perhaps really not be caged in the term of disorder and I think that something is damaged. I love very much this concept of kintsugi that is even in the book Transformed by Trauma. It's Japanese ancient art that means when the pottery was broken and later it was restored with a golden clue, and the new pottery is even much more beautiful than it was before. So the idea is that when the trauma happened, the person later is not damaged, it's just different, and sometimes even more beautiful because of those scars and those experiences. I think that is definitely the first stage, like in the Struggle Well program, is education. Let people know that, again, something happening with you right now, it doesn't mean that in future you will be damaged. And later, what is very important, I would say, it's a lot about support, peer-to-peer support. The same people who are next to you, your fellow citizens, who are going through the same atrocities and the same stress, but supporting each other. And definitely we have other stages that are equally very important. But I would say that, first of all, I would name this education and just knowing more about PTG, like First Lady said, knowing about PTG already gives this hope that we are growing during this war.
Josh, what do you think about the way that the model you've built here is exportable to different places and different times? So during a conflict, what kind of things do you think could start now in Ukraine? Would you see most applicable?
Yeah, and I think, Olena talked about this. It's like, you want to wait for the storm to pass. But if you do that, I think there's potentially a lot of damage that happens in the midst of that. And by the way, none of us know, and we can't have a crystal ball to figure this out. So I think there's no question. And Dr. Tedeschi runs our institute here. And one of the things we're big believers of is like, it's never too early to start. And so I think having those conversations, for example, if you have people rotating off the front lines, is how do you start to shape their perspective? Because from a human mental perspective, 80% of our thoughts on a daily basis are negative. And then you layer in negative events, and it's easy to see how someone gets stuck in this hole of despair. Then you add on the ubiquity of diagnoses, and you start to create a picture for someone that's very dark. And so it's like, how do you inject some light into that mix is really important. And then understanding, because one of the goals that we have is to normalize struggle and then democratize the ability for people to struggle well. We simply do not have enough mental health professionals in the world or in one country to serve everybody. So it's how do you equip people to do that? It has to be culturally appropriate. For example, we wrote a book called Struggle Well. The translation in Ukrainian is struggle with dignity, because if you translate struggle well, it means basically fight good, right? Which is kind of a weird way to do that. But so even it seems small, but how do you transfer over the metaphors, the stories, in a way that's really culturally appropriate? But as Olena said, the story of PTG is the story of every society. It really is. And I think that's creates a lot of hope for us that we can do this. And I think one of the things that as Olena goes home in October that we'll get to figure out is how does it translate there, similarly in the UK and in these other countries we operate in. But you also realize like every group you work with is a subculture. You know, the police are different than the fire community, than the dispatchers, than the military, than even groups within the military. So you're constantly getting to see the nuance, but also the universality of all of these things that we talk about.
The ideas that you've been describing and that you work with, has there been anywhere around the world where they have been applied or thought through the scale of a country? You know, Ukraine at war right now, across the whole of society, obviously. It sounds as if where you're coming from and where all the other programs that I've seen start with the individual and work out, and that's good. But now you've got a whole country to deal with. How do you even start? Is it appropriate?
Yeah, you know, when I look at that, I do really think about going back to how things used to be in societies, right? Where we had a much deeper sense of community, where people took care of each other. In some respects, you know, we're not a faith-based organization. Religion played a major role in helping inform and share the myths that allowed people to navigate struggle. I mean, it's why religion was created, to help people figure out how to deal with suffering. But there's no question, I mean, to your point, the ambition of this, I think, is significant. But that's why you really have to look, in some respects, at chunking it up into understanding different types of communities, whether it's the refugee community, it's the widow community, it's the military community, but also partnership, right? There's no sense in any way, shape, or form that we can try to do this all on our own. You really have to catalyze lots of people's creativity to figure out, like, okay, so, you know, you understand the UK system in a way that I don't. So if I share these ideas with you and then give you the ability to then translate it into your culture and your community, that's how this works. And so that's the democratization piece is, you know, we can share down and talk about these ideas, but we don't have to be the mouthpiece that does it to everybody. We can just inspire folks. And that's where I talk about this as a movement versus a program, is that idea comes to bear. When I think about like the best natural experiment for PTG, in 1973, 591 men came home from between 2.5 months and 9 years as prisoners of war in North Vietnam. And they feared the worst for these men. And 80% of them ended up better off than they were when they came home. And to this day, that stayed true. And so you have this interesting experiment of what can be possible within a culture, but in an entire country, no, never been done before. And I think this is one of the interesting opportunities that Ukraine has, because they're being so thoughtful about every part of this process. And I really admire not just what they're trying to do, but how they're thinking about doing it, the context in which it operates.
And just on that point there about the men that came back from North Vietnam, what was that put down to, why that cohort were able to survive and thrive?
The biggest thing, and this is where when we talk about like PTG, is it was the lens through which they were taught to view their experience. They were not allowed to become victims, right? When they would start to go down that place, they would be told, you have prison thinking, right? You think you're a prisoner, but you're not. And so it was the maintaining of hope and agency, mission and purpose, and a sense of community that allowed it to happen. And when you look at the process of PTG, one of the biggest parts is disclosure, is talking about stuff. Because, you know, when we don't know how to navigate life, we tend to accumulate a lot of shame. We feel inadequate. We feel broken. And at that prison, one of the things they made them do was called get on the wall. Every time they got tortured and they broke, they were required, ordered to share what happened to their neighbor. And they would use tap codes and other ways of communicating. And the idea was to receive some form of absolution, because if they built up shame, they would disconnect, they would isolate from the one thing they needed, which was each other. And that's at the heart of everything we do here. Is, in a lot of respects, psychotherapy is an individual activity. But when people are going through things, they need humanity. They need to feel like they're part of something. So that's why everything we do is done as a group, whether that's a group of 8, a group of 25, is because when you start to realize, like, I thought I was the only one, which is a common refrain in our programs, is people start to realize, like, I'm not special, right? And I'm not broken. I just don't know the answer. But somebody else has lived life, and they do, and they can help me understand that.
And Olena, so Ukraine, there's not going to be prisoner syndrome because everybody is going through it together. What do you see the biggest hurdles in trying to get some of these concepts going? Because it sounds like you've already got, or we've seen the resilience from society, and I'm using that word guardedly after what we said before. But I mean, the society really has come together. So it sounds as if there's a great opportunity there to do things. But what do you see as the priority for society at large in Ukraine?
I would say that is definitely what is very important right now, to change the language. Language from damage, disorder, to the language of the opportunity, to the language of the growth. I would say that changing this and normalizing narrative, I think it's something that appeals to me right now the most. And what is very important as well, reach out to all people, not only those people who can read Facebook or some journals, but people from rural population, and let them know that we were talking about that struggle is part of life. And you don't choose the time when you're living, but you're choosing what are you doing with this time, like in The Lord of the Rings is said, right? So I think that is the first. And second, feeling your own responsibility for the person next to you. I think it's something that Ukrainians are doing right now, being volunteering, supporting each other. But I think if we emphasize that even they are responsible for well-being of their neighbor as well, just being good listener, be warm enough, and we have everything in our culture for that. So I think it's again something not waiting that someone will come and help us, but doing our own steps. So again, I think we have everything for that. We just have to perhaps kind of frame and deliver this information to people.
And you go back in October, I understand,
yes.
And you're going to start trying to hope to put some of these programs in place?
Oh, we started already doing it here in Washington State. It's like pilot project for Ukrainian refugees. And I just hope to bring back to Ukraine and work with other cultures, with other ecosystems. And again, just repeating what our First Lady said, I think it's really this, that all stars align and all pieces are coming together, that it's definitely the best time to bring this concept.
Olena, Josh, thank you so much for introducing me to your work and this amazing facility here in Blue Mont.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you very much.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is today produced by Elliot Lampitt. The executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.